Oh, my child, today I'm 80 years old, living here in rural Alabama, but I'll never forget a difficult chapter of my life. I want to share this story with you who are listening. Go ahead and comment where you're listening from, and if you can, subscribe to the channel to keep following these life stories full of struggle and courage. This story takes place back in 1975, when I was a woman in my early 30s, full of courage but carrying the weight of seeing things nobody should see. I was a housekeeper in the home of one of the richest and most respected men in town, but inside that house, I discovered secrets that kept me awake at night and changed my life forever. Even today, I remember the look in that frightened little girl's eyes, the boss's daughter. It was for her that I did what I did, even knowing I could lose everything. So stay with me until the end of this story, and you'll understand what we're capable of doing out of true love and courage. And hey, if you like these heart-touching stories, click the button below to become a channel member. It helps us tremendously to continue bringing these memories of life and overcoming hardship. My name is Dorothy, but folks just call me Dottie. I was born and raised in this red clay soil of rural Alabama. I grew up watching my mother, Miss Raimunda, a strong woman with a big heart, teach me that life is hard but has beauty in small things, in the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the rooster's crow early in the morning. At the time, I was in my early 30s and lived with my mother, whose knees were worn out from working in the fields. That's when an acquaintance came to our house saying, "Dottie, Mr. Oliver needs a girl to work in his house." My mother immediately looked at me with a mixture of pride and fear. She pulled up a stool and said, "My child, are you sure about this? The big city has its dangers." I held her hand and replied, "Yes, Mom, I want this. It's my chance to help you and bring some money home." And so, in one breath, I packed my things and went with my head held high. I arrived at Mr. Oliver's house wearing a simple dress and carrying a small bundle of clothes. The mansion was large and imposing, with a rusty iron gate and a garden full of rose bushes that perfumed the entrance. My eyes lit up seeing a place so different from my little clay house. Mrs. Zena received me at the door. She was an elegant woman with a firm gaze and serious expression. "Dottie, you will take care of the house, the laundry, and help the cook." Without blinking, I replied, "You can count on me, Mrs. Zena. I'm used to hard work." She nodded and showed me the house. On my very first day, I got to know the kitchen that smelled of cornbread and fresh coffee. Miss Cindy, the cook, was a strong woman with an easy laugh and gentle speech. "Welcome, Dottie. Here we work hard, but we also eat mighty fine." I smiled and immediately felt welcomed as I helped Miss Cindy chop vegetables. She told me she had been working there for years and knew every corner of that house. "Mr. Oliver is a good boss, but he likes things his way," she whispered, passing me a tray full of potatoes. The routine was tough. I would wake before sunrise and already be in the kitchen preparing breakfast. Then I'd run to the yard to sweep the dry leaves and wash clothes in the tub, always with my hands in cold water and my head full of thoughts. One day, as I was scrubbing some sheets, Clara appeared at the door. "Good morning, Dottie." I smiled and said, "Good morning, Flower." "Want to help me with these clothes?" She gave a shy little laugh and stayed nearby, watching everything. Clara was a sweet girl with big brown eyes and very black hair, always tied with a red ribbon. She didn't talk much, but had a gentle way about her that soon captivated me. I liked her presence there in the yard. At lunch, Miss Cindy and I would always laugh between the pots and pans. "Did you see the way Mr. Oliver looks at the chickens? He might just serenade them," she would joke, and we would burst into laughter. It was good to have that happiness in the kitchen. Mrs. Zena spent the day in the sewing room or receiving visitors from town. "A rancher's wife has to keep up appearances," Miss Cindy would whisper. I would just laugh and think those people were indeed full of vanity. The meals were always plentiful: fluffy rice, cowboy beans, and pot roast with potatoes. At dinner time, Clara ate silently, and Mr. Oliver barely opened his mouth. It was a silence broken only by the crackling of wood in the stove. At the end of the day, I would retire to my small back room. It was simple, with a wooden bed, a trunk, and an oil lamp that I lit before going to bed. Lying there, I would hear the crickets and feel the gentle breeze coming through the window. One night, Miss Cindy brought up the subject while washing her hands at the sink. "Are you liking the job, Dottie?" I smiled and said, "Yes, Cindy. The people here are quiet, but the work is fair." She just shook her head and said softly, "Yes, but every house has its mysteries, my child." At that time, I didn't imagine those words would haunt me so much. I was just worried about sending money to my mother and getting on with my life. But little did I know that my story with little Clara was just beginning. Life went on without much novelty, but I began to notice that Clara was always very much to herself. She spent the day between the living room and the yard, with a lost look and closed mouth. I tried to make conversation, but she only responded quietly, as if she didn't want to bother anyone. This began to make my heart ache. One day, I saw her sitting on the kitchen step with a little cloth doll in her lap. "Are you playing alone, Clara?" I asked, kneeling beside her. "I'm just keeping the doll company," she said in a quiet voice. I gently stroked her hair, trying to show her she could trust me. Our bond grew slowly. Occasionally, I would call her to help fold cloths or stir the cornmeal in the pot. The girl seemed to feel safer when she was near me. I already felt it was more than an employer-employee relationship. It was a bond of care. Meanwhile, Mrs. Zena seemed to live in another world, spending time embroidering and taking care of household things. "Mrs. Zena is rather distant, isn't she?" I commented to Miss Cindy in the kitchen. "That's her way, Dottie. A cold woman who just lives in her own corner," she replied, while stirring the beans. One afternoon, Clara helped me peel cassava, and for the first time she spoke without me having to draw her out much. "Dottie, have you ever been afraid of being alone?" I looked into her eyes and said, "Yes, Clara, but we always find a way to feel strong." The next day, as I was sweeping the yard, Mr. Oliver appeared at the kitchen door. "Dottie, I want you to clean my office today." I replied, "Yes, sir." I found it strange. He almost never asked me to go there. The office was a closed room with dark furniture and a strong smell of tobacco. While dusting, I noticed some old family photographs on the wall. Clara was just a baby in one of them, looking sad in someone's arms. At the end of the day, I sat with Miss Cindy and commented, "That office gives me the creeps, Cindy." She made the sign of the cross and said, "There are things in there we don't know about, Dottie. I feel it in my heart." This left me thoughtful. That night, I lay down with a weight in my chest. I was beginning to realize that house had silences that spoke louder than words, and I was in the middle of it all, trying to understand what Clara carried in her gaze. At breakfast the next morning, Clara pulled her chair close to mine and said quietly, "Dottie, can you teach me to make bread someday?" I smiled and replied, "Of course, my flower. It would be an honor." She smiled back, and I felt she was beginning to trust me more. In the yard, I saw Mr. Oliver talking with a well-dressed man. Miss Cindy whispered, "That's the sheriff. He's here all the time, like family." I kept that in mind as I finished sweeping the yard. On Sundays, the family would go to Mass at the downtown church. I would stay behind, taking care of the house and enjoying the silence. But that Sunday, Clara decided to stay too, saying she had a stomachache. I found it strange. I spent the morning in the kitchen and noticed Clara sitting in the yard, hugging her doll. "Are you in a lot of pain, Clara?" I asked. She shook her head. "I just wanted to stay home today." I respected her silence but remained alert. In the afternoon, I brought a piece of cake and juice. "Do you want to talk a little?" I asked. She replied quietly, "I like when you're around, Dottie. You're good to me." That cut my heart, and I held her little hand. At the end of the day, when everyone returned from Mass, Mr. Oliver called me in the hallway. "Dottie, keep an eye on the girl." I replied, "Yes, sir." But inside, I began to wonder what he meant by that. Later, Miss Cindy brought up the subject while closing the windows. "Clara is closer to you now, isn't she?" I agreed. Yes, and I'm happy about that. She looked at me seriously. Then take good care of her, Dottie. That girl needs you. In my little room, I thought about Miss Cindy's words and Clara's frightened look. Something in that house gave me a tightness in my chest, but I still didn't know the size of the trouble. In the following days, Clara began to spend more time with me in the kitchen. "Dottie, does your mother live far away?" she asked once. "She lives on the farm, my flower. She's there waiting for me to bring her a little money for the bills." She smiled. One afternoon, while we were folding sheets, Clara commented, "I wish I could visit your mother someday." My heart tightened, but I said, "Maybe someday you will, right?" And I smiled, disguising the sadness. And so, with gentle conversation and affection, our friendship was strengthened, and I already knew deep in my heart that this girl needed me more than I could imagine. But I hadn't yet dreamed of the weight that responsibility would bring to my life. The routine in the house continued its slow pace, but every look from Clara showed me that she carried a great weight in her heart. At breakfast, I noticed she barely touched the bread, her eyes fixed on the window as if seeking answers on the horizon. After washing the dishes, I sat with Miss Cindy in the corner of the kitchen. "Cindy, this girl is shrinking more each day," I confided. Miss Cindy, stirring the broth in the pot, shook her head. "Dottie, there's something here that only time will untangle." I decided to keep Clara busy all day. I invited her to tend the garden with me, and she even smiled when I showed her how to plant a small sprig of rosemary. "This smell reminds me of my grandmother's house," she murmured. I took the opportunity to tell a story from my childhood, trying to draw another smile from her. While we were hanging clothes on the line, Clara looked at me and blurted out awkwardly, "Dottie, do you think people really see everything?" The question froze me for a second. "Not always, my flower. There are things adults pretend not to see, and that's worse." She nodded in silence. At dinner, the atmosphere remained heavy. Clara pushed the rice around on her plate, Mrs. Zena with her head down, and Mr. Oliver with a furrowed brow, chewing in silence. I felt the tension creeping across the table. Late that night, Clara knocked softly on my door, her doll clutched to her chest. Without saying a word, she nestled near my feet. I stayed there, stroking her hair while the wind outside made the house creak. The next day, as I was beating the sofa cushions, I noticed Clara hesitating in the doorway. "Do you want to help, my flower?" I asked. She just nodded and sat on the floor, observing everything in silence. When I went to fold clothes in my room, Clara appeared with a piece of cloth. "Dottie, I made a handkerchief for you." The simple gift moved me, and I hugged that fragile girl who just wanted a safe place. Miss Cindy, seeing me with the handkerchief, whispered, "That girl trusts you, Dottie. It's not just anything, it's more than affection." I agreed with a tightness in my chest, feeling the responsibility growing. Later, Clara accompanied me while I swept the yard. Her silence no longer bothered me. It was as if we were creating our own code. "Dottie, have you ever felt you needed to protect someone?" My eyes filled with tears. "Yes, my flower, and I'm feeling that now." Miss Cindy called me aside after dinner. "Mr. Oliver wants you to clean the office tomorrow morning." That gave me chills. "Be careful, you hear? There's bad energy in there." I just nodded without saying a word. The next morning, while watering the plants, I noticed that Clara avoided the hallway leading to the office, preferring to stay on the porch playing with dry leaves. I decided to respect the silence and just stay nearby. At the end of the day, as we went down to the yard together, she grabbed my arm. "Dottie, just stay close." I said quietly, "I'm here, my flower, and I'll stay." And it was there, sitting under the mango tree's shade, that I realized the bond between us was already as strong as the roots of an ancient tree, and that I needed to be the strength that Clara was seeking so desperately. That morning, Clara was quieter than usual. I was stirring the coffee in the kitchen when I saw her standing at the door, hugging her doll, eyes downcast, seeming to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Dottie, can I stay here for a bit?" she whispered in a gentle voice. I nodded, pulled up a chair, and continued with the bread dough while she sat there looking at the floor. As the smell of rising bread filled the kitchen, Clara looked at me sideways and spoke very quietly. Dottie, there are things in this house I don't like. My heart froze. I held the dough in my hands and waited. I knew it was time to listen patiently, the way only a mother at heart knows how to do. My father sometimes calls me to the office, and I don't want to go, but he makes me. Her voice trembled, and I swallowed hard. I approached slowly, sat beside her, and held her small hand. You don't need to tell me everything now, my flower, but I'm here, okay? She nodded without looking at me. Clara took a deep breath and looked at the kitchen window where the wind made the curtains sway. I'm afraid of the dark in there, and of him. I felt my legs weaken, but I kept calm so as not to frighten even more this girl who trusted me so much. Later, folding towels with her in the back room, I carefully asked, Clara, have you ever told your mother about this? She lowered her head and replied, Mom is always busy or in bed. She says I should obey my father. That hurt me more than stumping my toe on a rock. I was silent for a few seconds, then squeezed her hand affectionately. You trust me, don't you, my flower? She looked at me with eyes full of water and nodded slowly, passing me a sadness that tore through my chest. Miss Cindy arrived with a basket of clothes and noticed the atmosphere. What happened, Clara? The girl quickly hid behind me. Just a chat between us, Miss Cindy, I replied, trying to disguise it. But Miss Cindy knew my look and realized the conversation was more serious than it seemed. At lunchtime, Clara barely touched her food. The girl played with her fork, Mrs. Zena distracted, and Mr. Oliver eating in silence as if nothing was out of place. The weight of that table was like a stone in my chest. Later in the yard, Clara was helping me water the plants when she suddenly stopped and said quietly, He says I'm special, Dottie, but I don't like when he calls me at night. My heart leaped from my chest. I held her little hand firmly. That evening, I sat in the kitchen with Miss Cindy, my head boiling. Cindy, this girl is afraid of her father. She widened her eyes and whispered, Dottie, something is wrong, and we know that messing with the boss's house causes problems. I took a deep breath and replied, But I won't turn my back on this girl. Later, preparing tea on the wood stove, I felt Clara lean against me and hug me tightly. Her crying came down hot and silent. I could only hold her in my lap, trying to pass courage in the midst of that pain. In the middle of the night, I heard the slight creaking of the door and the sound of little barefoot steps in the hallway. I got up slowly and found Clara huddled in the doorway. Can I sleep here? She murmured. I opened the blanket and pulled her to my side. In the darkness of the room, I hugged the girl and whispered, Are you safe here, my flower? She nestled against me, trembling like a frightened bird, and fell asleep with her face hidden against my chest. The next day, I observed every movement in the house with lynx eyes. Whenever Mr. Oliver called Clara, she would return more silent. The girl was fading away like a candle in the wind. While we were tending the garden, Clara asked, Dottie, have you ever been trapped in a place you didn't want to be? I held my breath for a moment. Yes, my flower, but we always find a way out. She nodded without saying anything more. Late in the afternoon, as I was hanging clothes on the line, I felt Clara watching me with eyes full of hope and fear. That's when I understood she was placing all the trust in the world in me. That night, I knelt on the floor of my room and asked for strength. I knew I needed to be strong for me and for her. Clara was just a girl and already carried a burden that no child should bear. I looked out the window at the starry sky and made a promise. If it depends on me, my flower will not cry in hiding in this house anymore. The cold wind came through the window and raised goosebumps on my skin, but I knew my decision was made. And in that house of thick walls and hidden whispers, I felt that courage was my only way out. I was going to protect that girl, even if it was the last thing I did in this world. That morning, I got up with a tightness in my chest. Clara was still sleeping in my room, curled up beside me, hugging her worn doll. I looked at her and thought about how such a small child could carry such great sadness. That house full of thick walls and heavy silences seemed more suffocating with each day. I felt that day would be different, but I still didn't know the size of the storm that was coming. Early in the morning, Mr. Oliver called me. "Dottie, clean my office after breakfast." His tone was firm, in that way that only someone used to giving orders knows how to do. I responded with a nod, but inside I felt my stomach churning. The office always had a strange smell, and just thinking about being alone in there made my heart race, especially after everything Clara had been telling me. While preparing coffee in the kitchen, Clara entered with her head down, her eyes seeking the floor as if afraid to face the world. "Are you going to the office today?" I tried to smile and reassure her. "Yes, my flower, just to clean, but you don't need to go there, okay?" She just nodded, hugging her doll tightly, as if it were the only friend left in that mansion. I went to the office after everyone left the table. While I was dusting the dark wooden bookshelf, I heard a creak from the half-open door. My heart raced. I hid behind the heavy curtain, my breath caught in my throat, and peeked without being seen. I knew I shouldn't be there, but something told me I needed to see. Mr. Oliver entered with Clara by the hand. My heart raced, and I almost stopped breathing. He closed the door with his other hand and, in a tone that was too gentle, said, "Let's play again, my princess." That tone gave me chills. It was a way of speaking that I had heard before in other houses, but never wanted to believe I would hear there. Clara, with eyes full of fear, slowly shook her head. "I don't want to, Dad." My blood froze. I wanted to get out of there and take her in my arms, but my legs seemed glued to the floor. My hands were shaking, and I forced myself to remain silent so as not to spoil everything. He insisted, kneeling beside her and taking a candy from his suit pocket. "Remember last time? Nobody needs to know." Clara was holding the doll so tightly that her fingers were white. I felt powerless, hidden and silent, as if the world had stopped around me. Time seemed to stop. Each of his movements seemed calculated, cold. When he passed his hand over Clara's face, I felt disgusted, and tears threatened to fall, but I needed to be strong for her. There, behind the curtain, I realized that everything Clara feared was more real than I wanted to admit. Before I could do anything, Mrs. Zena appeared in the hallway, knocking on the door. "Oliver, come quickly. The doctor is here." He became irritated and replied harshly, "I'm coming." Clara sighed with relief, and I clung to the curtain, trying to control my crying. After they left the office, I waited a while and then knelt on the floor, feeling hot tears falling. I knew I had seen enough to confirm what Clara felt. My head was spinning, and my chest felt crushed. I needed to protect that girl, but how? At the end of the day, I told everything to Miss Cindy. "Cindy, I saw it with my own eyes. He's hurting the girl." Miss Cindy crossed herself and looked at me seriously, her eyes wide. "Dottie, this can't continue. You're going to have to be the courage of this house." I swallowed hard and nodded. That night, I sat with Clara on the porch. The starry sky seemed to be listening to us. "My flower, I saw what happened today." She looked at me, frightened, and lowered her head. "I'm with you. Do you hear me?" I held her hand firmly, wanting to pass on security. Clara cried softly in my lap. "I thought it was my fault, Dottie." My chest tightened even more. "It's never your fault, my flower, and we're going to fix this. Do you trust me?" She nodded with watery eyes and a tight heart. After putting Clara to bed, I sat for hours on the edge of the bed, thinking about what to do. I was just a maid, but I knew I could no longer turn away and pretend it was just another wrong thing in the boss's house. The next day, Clara helped me in the kitchen. She seemed lighter for having confided in me, but fear still hung in her eyes like a heavy cloud before the rain. I pretended normalcy, but my chest burned with concern. Later, when I was alone in the garden, I prayed for a way out. I couldn't allow that girl to continue suffering, not after everything I had seen and heard. It was time to act with heart and the courage of someone who knows the weight of silence. The mansion, once just cold, now seemed like a minefield. I needed to move carefully, but courage was already firm in my chest. The walls whispered, and I knew I was being watched. At that moment, I promised myself that Clara would no longer face this alone, and that, whatever it cost, I would get her out of that place, even if I had to face the whole world. The sun set slowly that afternoon, and I felt that promise would be the thread guiding my life from then on. And when night fell over the mansion, I knew that from then on, nothing would be the same, because when you choose to protect someone, there's no turning back. Courage already lives in your chest and becomes part of your story. The next day, I woke up earlier than the rooster. Fear wouldn't let me sleep properly. I went straight to the kitchen and found Miss Cindy arranging the firewood in the stove. "Today is going to be heavy, Cindy," I commented. She just nodded, as if she already knew that day would be different. The sky was still dark outside, and the wind was hitting the window hard, as if wanting to warn that something bad was coming. Clara appeared at the door with deep eyes and her doll in her lap. "Dottie, will you stay with me today?" "Yes, my flower." But deep down, I already knew I would have to face much more than just the routine of the house. The way she clung to that doll broke my heart. I wanted so much to be able to snatch her away from there at that moment, but it wasn't the right time yet. Mr. Oliver spent breakfast with that fake smile, greeting Clara with an icy kiss on the forehead. I felt my blood boil, but I swallowed hard and continued serving the toast. The silence at the table was suffocating, and each of his movements seemed too calculated, as if he were always acting for whoever wanted to see. After everyone left the room, Clara pulled me aside. "He said he's going to call me to the office today." I stroked her hair and promised, "You won't be alone anymore, okay? I promise." The girl looked at me with those frightened eyes, and I felt the weight of that promise. I knew I couldn't fail. I spent the rest of the morning with my heart in my hand. While washing clothes in the tub, I kept watching the house. The silence was so dense you could cut it with a knife. "Mr." Oliver's shadow through the window made me shudder, but I couldn't let my guard down. At lunchtime, Mr. Oliver called Clara with a heavy look. I followed them from a distance and hid behind the half-open door of the office. This time, it wasn't just a conversation. The tone of his voice and the way he held Clara made my legs weak. He locked the door and began to whisper in the girl's ear. His voice had a sweet tone that chilled to the bone. Clara stood motionless, looking like a shadow of herself. My stomach turned and cold sweat ran down my forehead. I needed to do something. I peeked through the crack in the door and saw when he held the girl's arm firmly. Clara squeezed the doll and bit her lips. My heart almost jumped out of my mouth, and my hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped the cloth I was holding. That's when the back door of the house slammed shut with the wind, and he was distracted. I ran from there, but I knew I couldn't just keep watching. I needed a plan. That man could no longer have the girl in his hands without anyone seeing. Later in the kitchen, I called Miss Cindy and told her everything. "Cindy, we have to make Mrs. Zena see with her own eyes." She widened her eyes. "Dottie, this is too dangerous." "I know, but if her mother sees, no one will be able to pretend anymore." We agreed to watch Mr. Oliver's steps. We needed a chance for Mrs. Zena to see what we already knew. I just had no idea how, but deep down, I felt the opportunity would appear. I just had to be patient. In the following days, Clara followed me everywhere. When we were alone, she would say, "Dottie, don't let him take me again, please." My chest would break. I would stroke her hair and respond with affection, "I won't let him, my flower." One afternoon, as I was sweeping the yard, I saw Mrs. Zena leave the room complaining of a headache. That's when an idea came to mind. If I could get her to approach the office at the right time, maybe everything would change. The next day, I left an anonymous note on her bedroom door. "Pay attention to what happens in the office," and waited with my heart in my hand and my thoughts hammering 1,000 possibilities. When Clara was called to the office again, I hid in a corner of the living room and watched. Mrs. Zena passed through the hallway and hesitated in front of the closed door. The tension in the air was so thick I could barely breathe. I saw doubt in her eyes, but she moved on, shaking her head. I felt enormous frustration. Her fear seemed greater than her willingness to see the truth. It was as if she were running away from her own motherly instinct. At the end of the day, I talked with Clara on the porch. "My flower, we're going to find a way." She cried softly and only said, "You're my best friend." I held her tightly in my lap and felt the strength of our connection growing. That night, I sat in the room with Miss Cindy. "Cindy," she couldn't look. "She's afraid." Cindy sighed. "Sometimes it's easier to close your eyes, Dottie. But you're not going to give up, are you?" I shook my head with eyes full of water. I surely wasn't going to. Each day that passed, I felt that Clara depended on me like someone depends on air to breathe. She was trusting me to be her shield. I couldn't and didn't want to fail her. I spent the week on the lookout. Every time Mr. Oliver took Clara to the office, I was on guard, but I knew that just watching wasn't enough. I needed to take a bigger step, even if it put everything at risk. On a rainy afternoon, while Clara was helping me peel potatoes, she told me, "He said if I tell, nobody will believe me, not even Mom." I held her hand and promised, "I believe you, my flower, and I'm going to prove you're telling the truth." The plan formed slowly in my head. I needed to make Mrs. Zena catch everything. I needed to create the right situation. Only then might she set aside her fear and see what was right under her nose. On Sunday, with the house full of visitors, Mr. Oliver controlled himself, but I knew it was just a matter of time, and I would be ready. Every movement, every word of his was a warning that the danger hadn't passed. That week, Mrs. Zena was acting strange, with a lost look around the house. I noticed she stopped more often in the hallways, as if listening to something beyond the walls. The note I left must have planted some doubt, and that gave me a glimmer of hope. But at the same time, it made me apprehensive. I knew that doubts sometimes hide behind closed doors and that fear was a treacherous beast inside that house. In the kitchen, while Miss Cindy was kneading the bread, I whispered, "Cindy, have you noticed Mrs. Zena is quieter?" She looked around and said softly, "She's more jumpy, Dottie. I think the note shook her." The smell of yeast and burning wood couldn't disguise the heavy atmosphere hanging over the house. It seemed that even the walls were whispering, and we could only pray for Mrs. Zena to listen. Clara, for her part, wouldn't leave my side. Each step was measured, and her look seemed to beg for protection. "Dottie, do you think my mother will ever believe me?" I hugged her tightly and replied, "She will, my flower. You'll see." The tight hug was all I could offer at that moment, while my head was boiling, trying to find a way to end that torment. In the late afternoon, Mr. Oliver entered the office and locked the door. My heart raced. This time, Mrs. Zena appeared in the hallway, but instead of just peeking, she slowly went down the stairs and hid behind the salon door, very close to the office. It was a subtle movement, but to me, it screamed. For the first time, she seemed determined to discover what was hidden behind that door. As I watched from the living room, I saw her put her ear to the wall, trying to hear what was happening inside. It was the first time she had done something like this. Fear was still in her eyes, but now the desire to know was greater. I saw her shoulders tremble and her hands clutching the hem of her apron. I knew she was fighting between fear and the need to face the truth. The next day, the routine seemed the same, but Mrs. Zena was more attentive. She left the room earlier, spent more time around the office, and observed Clara with watery eyes, as if she already suspected the horror that haunted her house. She could no longer pretend not to notice her daughter's frightened manner or the tension that hung in the air whenever Mr. Oliver came near. At lunchtime, she observed Clara in a way I had never seen before. It was a look of someone beginning to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Mr. Oliver, on the other side of the table, didn't suspect his wife's unease. He even seemed satisfied, smiling as if he controlled every corner of that house. But Mrs. Zena was no longer the same. "Mrs. Zena is seeing, Dottie," whispered Miss Cindy later as we dried the dishes. "She's starting to connect the dots." I nodded, feeling my heart tighten. "I hope she doesn't close her eyes again, Cindy, because I knew well how it was easier to pretend certain things didn't exist when they were too painful to face." That afternoon, Clara was playing on the porch when Mr. Oliver called her to the office. I stood ready, observing everything. Mrs. Zena, who was passing with a basket of clothes, stopped in the stairwell and went up to the second floor. Her steps were slow and hesitant, but determined, as if each step were a battle won against her own fear. From above, she watched through the crack of an open Venetian blind that gave a partial view of the office. It was there that I saw courage being born on her face, still timid. She wanted to see with her own eyes, even if her heart was breaking into pieces. Her gaze was fixed on Clara, as if looking for signs that would confirm her suspicions. Later, when the house was already quiet, I went to Clara's room. "My flower, your mother is beginning to see." Clara looked at me with hope. "Do you think she'll save me, Dottie?" I felt a lump in my throat, but smiled so as not to worry the girl even more. "I think she's almost ready for that, my flower. She just needs a little push." I stayed with her until she fell asleep, then went to the kitchen where Miss Cindy was waiting for me with strong coffee. With each conversation between us, I realized more and more that the final decision had to be Mrs. Zena's. "It's time to think of a way for her to see with her eyes what happens in that office, Dottie," said Miss Cindy. I sighed deeply. "Yes, Cindy, we can't just wait anymore." It was time to transform suspicion into certainty. Clara's life depended on it. The next day, the tension in the house was so great that even the pictures on the walls seemed crooked. Mr. Oliver locked himself in the office for hours, and Mrs. Zena roamed the house like a shadow, without the courage to face what she already knew. But each day, she was getting closer to the truth. That's when I decided to act. I was going to create a situation where Mrs. Zena would no longer be able to ignore it. A plan that involved Clara without putting her in danger. But that would make the truth jump out at her mother. It needed to be subtle, but strong enough to break through the denial once and for all. That night, I wrote an anonymous letter imitating the handwriting of a friend of Mrs. Zena's. It said there were rumors in town about things happening inside her house and that she should open her eyes. The paper trembled in my hand as I finished writing. I left the letter under her bedroom door and went to the kitchen to pray in silence. The weight of guilt and anguish was already part of my routine, but I knew I needed to push Mrs. Zena to see the truth. It was now or never. The next morning, I observed Mr. Oliver's every step. I saw when he whispered to Clara and then went straight to the office. My heart was beating like a drum in a marching band. I hid behind the curtain, ready to see if my plan would work. I hid near the stairs and saw Mrs. Zena leave the room with the letter in her trembling hands. She slowly went down the stairs and headed straight for the office corridor. Her gaze was heavy with fear, but also with a decision that seemed to be forming in those hesitant steps. This time, she didn't just stop at the door. She walked to the window that faced the back of the office and peeked through the crack in the curtain. And I, from a distance, saw her face turn pale. She saw something that made her tremble slightly, her eyes full of tears. From that moment, I knew Mrs. Zena had finally seen. Now it was just a matter of time until she decided what to do with the weight of the truth she had avoided until now. I could only wait and hope that a mother's love would be greater than any fear. That morning, Mrs. Zena seemed like a different woman. Doubt had turned to certainty, and you could see it in the tightness of her lips, in the firm way she held her coffee cup, and in the heavy silence she carried. The kitchen seemed too small for all the thoughts running through her head, and every movement she made seemed calculated, as if she had finally decided to face what she had avoided for so long. Miss Cindy and I exchanged attentive glances as we washed the dishes. Clara played with dolls in the corner, but we knew the heavy atmosphere had even contaminated the toys. Mrs. Zena observed her daughter with a tightness in her chest and tears hidden in the corners of her eyes. Fear and guilt seemed to mix in that distant and suffering gaze. After lunch, Mr. Oliver went out to take care of business in town. It was the perfect cue for Mrs. Zena to call me to a corner of the pantry and ask in a low voice, almost whispering, "Dottie, have you seen anything strange between Oliver and Clara?" My heart raced in a way that made it feel like it was going to come out of my mouth. It was the first time she had spoken about it out loud. The weight of her words fell on me like a flood. I tried to stay calm and replied, "Mrs. Zena, I can't tell you everything, but you already know deep down what there is to know." She sighed deeply, her eyes watering, and I realized she was struggling not to collapse. That afternoon, Mrs. Zena went upstairs with firm steps and entered Clara's room. They stayed in there for a good while. When they came out, Clara was hugging her mother, her eyes red and swollen. The girl was crying softly, and Mrs. Zena was holding her in her arms as if she wanted to protect her from the whole world. Later, while I was cleaning the porch, I heard the two of them talking in the garden, hidden among the trees. "Mom, I tried to tell you, but you wouldn't listen." Mrs. Zena, with tears in her eyes and a breaking voice, replied, "I was blind, my daughter, but now I see, and I won't let him hurt you anymore." At dinner, Mrs. Zena barely looked at her husband. I noticed every small gesture from her, the spoon hitting the plate, the fork held too tightly in her hand, her eyes always avoiding him. Mr. Oliver continued calmly, not noticing that his castle was beginning to crumble right under his nose. The next day, she called me to help arrange the wardrobe in her bedroom. Among the clothes and sheets, she said in a decisive tone, "Dottie, I won't let this continue. My daughter won't suffer anymore in this house." My heart almost jumped out of my chest. Finally, she was ready to act. Clara told me later that her mother had asked her not to be alone with her father anymore. "Now she's always nearby, Dottie. Mom is afraid, but she's trying." I hugged the girl and said, "You have a strong mother, my flower. She'll take care of you. You can trust her." At night, Mrs. Zena roamed the house like a silent shadow. She watched her husband's every step, observed his conversations with Clara, and seemed ready to intervene at any moment. I watched everything from a distance. When Mr. Oliver called Clara to the office, Zena went in with them without giving explanations. "I need to talk to you, Oliver." He widened his eyes, surprised by his wife's attitude, but she remained firm, holding her daughter's hand. Mr. Oliver tried to disguise his surprise with an awkward smile. "What is it now, woman?" But her tone was one of someone who would no longer accept excuses. "Clara stays with me today." I saw the discomfort stamped on his face, but Mrs. Zena didn't back down. The next day, the tension increased even more. Mrs. Zena seemed like a shadow behind her husband. Wherever he went, she went too, even in the simplest tasks like inspecting the garden or organizing papers. She was there, firm. Mr. Oliver began to get irritated but tried to maintain his composure, especially in front of the employees. But you could see in his eyes that the situation was beginning to slip out of control. The atmosphere in the house was pure electricity. In the kitchen, Miss Cindy commented quietly, "That woman is building up courage, Dottie. She's going to face the beast." I nodded and whispered back, "It's about time, Cindy." The smell of fresh coffee couldn't disguise the nervousness growing between us. Later, Mrs. Zena asked me to keep an eye on Clara while she went to talk to an old friend. It was rare for her to leave the house without telling her husband. I knew this was part of the plan she had been secretly plotting. When she returned, she brought an envelope hidden in her clothes. She called me to a corner and whispered, "I'm already preparing everything. That man won't touch my daughter again." Courage shone in her eyes, along with a touch of fear. That night, Mr. Oliver tried to call Clara to the office again, but Mrs. Zena stood in front of the door. "Not today, Oliver. Today my daughter stays with me." His gaze froze, but she stood firm like a rock. Clara, on the other side of the hallway, held my hand tightly. I knelt beside her and whispered, "See my flower? Your mother is protecting you." And her eyes shone full of tears and hope. The next day, Mrs. Zena confided in me, "Dottie, I'm going to take my daughter far away from here. I've already talked to trusted people in town." My heart tightened, but I knew it was the right thing to do. It was time to escape that nightmare. Later, when Clara hugged me and said, "Dottie, Mom said we're going to run away," I held back my emotion and said, "Yes, you are my flower, and I'll help in any way I can," because at that moment, that was all that mattered. That night, the house seemed smaller and suffocating. The tension between Mrs. Zena and Mr. Oliver was visible, but her courage filled every corner. I knew something big was about to happen, and Clara's freedom was near. Mrs. Zena was no longer going to close her eyes. For the first time in a long time, I saw in her the strength of a mother ready to fight tooth and nail for her daughter, and I was willing to stand by them to the end. While Mr. Oliver dined calmly, unaware that the siege was closing in, Mrs. Zena was already plotting the next step, and deep down, I felt that house would never be the same again. That morning, the air was heavy as lead. It seemed even the walls were breathing that bad atmosphere. Mrs. Zena was trembling just from breathing, and the tension in the house seemed to stick to every corner. Clara, sitting in the corner of the living room, played without really understanding what was happening, but we could see in her manner that something wasn't right in that place, as if even the girl could sense the storm that was coming. Mr. Oliver adjusted his suit jacket with anger, his cutting gaze crossing the breakfast table. He didn't even say good morning, just grumbled, tightened his fists, and slammed the door with force. Mrs. Zena sighed and said quietly, "Dottie, today we put an end to this." My heart raced. It seemed like at any moment the walls would collapse with so much weight in the air. In the kitchen, she pulled me into a corner with watery but firm eyes. "It will work out, Dottie. Today I'm going to resolve this." Her manner gave me both hope and fear at the same time. I nodded, trying to show courage, but my hands were shaking. Mrs. Zena was no longer the same. She was determined. Soon after, she took Clara to town, saying she was going to visit a distant friend. Before leaving, she looked at me firmly and whispered, "Keep an eye on the bastard." My stomach turned inside out, but I promised I wouldn't take my eyes off him for a second. I knew that day would be long and dangerous. Mr. Oliver locked himself in the office and began talking to himself in there. "I won't lose my daughter to that woman. This house is mine. That girl is mine." I, hidden behind the door, trembled. The tone of his voice was of someone about to explode and do something with no turning back. I ran to tell Miss Cindy, who looked at me terrified. "Cindy, he's distraught. He's dangerous." She rubbed her hands on her apron and murmured, "That man is sick, my child. He's got the devil in him." The fear stamped on her face only increased my dread and the certainty that we needed to act. Before Mrs. Zena returned, I sat on the edge of the bed and wrote a letter to my mother. I quickly explained what was happening, said I was helping Mrs. Zena and that I would soon return home. I carefully folded the paper, put it in an envelope, and asked Miss Cindy to deliver it to my mother as soon as she could. When Mrs. Zena returned in the late afternoon, there was a different flame in her gaze. She seemed stronger. She called me to the pantry and whispered, "The suitcases are hidden in the car. It's almost time." I felt a chill in my belly and the certainty that the moment had come. At night, Mr. Oliver tried to call Clara, but Mrs. Zena put herself between him and the girl. "Clara will stay with me today." He disguised his fury, but his gaze seemed like pure fire. The tension in the room was like a sharp knife ready to cut the air. After dinner, Mrs. Zena whispered again, "Tomorrow morning we escape. We'll disappear before he notices." I held her hand and said, "I'm with you to the end." The lump in my throat seemed endless, but courage was beginning to take over me. In the middle of the night, Mr. Oliver prowled like a wounded beast in the house, with heavy steps and labored breathing. He only fell asleep when the moonshine knocked him out in the living room chair. Mrs. Zena gave the signal, and we began to act. In the silence of dawn, we carried Clara without making a sound, heart in mouth with each step. The car, hidden at the back of the property, was waiting for us with the door ajar. Each movement was a challenge against the fear that stuck to our skin. In the yard, the fog covered the path, but we continued anyway. "Go, Dottie. Now's the time," whispered Mrs. Zena. When the car engine started and we left the house behind, I felt that Clara's life was beginning again. The house disappeared in the dust of the dirt road. Mrs. Zena, with tears falling down her face, murmured, "He will never lay a finger on my daughter again." I took a deep breath with a tightness in my chest and the sensation of relief and fear together. On the road, Clara slept in her mother's lap, snuggled as if for the first time in years she had found a safe place. The silence of the car was only broken by the noise of the engine and by Mrs. Zena's contained sobs. We stopped at a simple inn on the roadside with dim light and the smell of fresh coffee. Mrs. Zena hugged me tightly. "Without you, I wouldn't have made it." I cried with her, feeling that her courage had saved the girl's life. In the following days, we jumped from city to city, always alert, always afraid of the past knocking at the door. But gradually, Mrs. Zena's courage and Clara's hope began to blossom slowly. On the last night before arriving at Mrs. Zena's sister's house, she said, "Dottie, my girl is free now, but my fight isn't over yet." I agreed in silence, knowing that we would still have shadows to face. When we arrived at her sister's house, Clara jumped into her aunt's arms with a smile I hadn't seen in a long time. It was the smile of a child who felt the nightmare had been left behind and who could finally dream again. The house was simple, but full of warmth and coziness. Mrs. Zena pulled me aside and said, "Now we're safe, but I'll never forget what that man did." Her voice trembled, but had strength. As Clara ran through the yard with the freedom of someone reborn, Mrs. Zena spoke emotionally. "She's a child again, Dottie, and that's all that matters." I agreed, feeling that every tear shed had been worth it. Mr. Oliver's shadow still loomed, but the brightness in Clara's eyes was stronger, and I knew that a new story was beginning there, far from fear and pain. Mrs. Zena had won a war. Mrs. Zena's embrace that night told me everything. "Never again, Dottie, never again will my daughter live in fear." And I, with a full heart, knew she would fulfill that promise no matter what. And there, in that simple little house, I saw the strength of a mother who faced the impossible, a woman who became a lioness to protect her cub. And I knew their lives would never be the same after that night. When dawn broke in that simple house of Mrs. Zena's sister, we felt for the first time in a long time a smell of peace in the air. It was as if the sun shone differently, as if the weight we carried had been left in the dust of the road. Mrs. Zena and Clara stayed there for months until they got back on their feet for good. Mrs. Zena found work at the fair selling baked goods and vegetables. Clara went back to school, and each day seemed lighter and more cheerful. At first, Clara still woke up frightened during the night, but with time, the nightmares gave way to children's dreams. Mrs. Zena did everything to make her daughter return to being that happy girl she always deserved to be. I helped as I could, staying with Clara while Mrs. Zena worked. We laughed, cooked, and even made up stories before bed. The girl hugged me tightly as if I were a second mother. In the town square, we took Clara to play. Mrs. Zena and I would sit on the bench and exchange confidences while watching the girl running around the playground. These were moments of reconstruction for all of us. As for me, after some time with them, I decided to return to my mother as I had promised in the letter. The farewell was full of tears and sweet words, but with a tight hug and a promise to never lose contact. Mr. Oliver, after our escape, was furious. He went after his wife and daughter, but justice arrived first. Miss Cindy with courage, handed over to the sheriff everything she knew. Mr. Oliver ended up in prison for abuse and violence. The process was lengthy, but the testimony of Miss Cindy and other people from the town was enough. Mr. Oliver never came out from behind bars, and there he aged alone, far from the people he once claimed to love. Miss Cindy, after everything, also left that house. She went to work as a cook at a hotel in the neighboring town. We wrote to each other from time to time, always sharing news and giving strength to each other. As the years passed, Clara grew up strong and free. She went to college, got married, and had 2 children. Mrs. Zena, proud, always said, "My girl won, Dottie. Our fight was worth every tear." Mrs. Zena also remained firm. She continued working at the fair, but with a heart full of joy. The faith and strength she carried inspired everyone around her. She became an example in the community. Clara and her mother never hid from anyone the story they lived. They always said that speaking was important so that other children would never go through what they went through. And I returned to my town, helped my mother, and then built my own life. I got married, had children and grandchildren. Today, at 80, I sit on this porch and remember that story as a milestone of courage and love. From time to time, I still write to Mrs. Zena and Clara. Our letters are full of memories and gratitude. Life separated us in distance, but never in heart. The lesson I take is that we can never turn our backs on those who need us, even with fear. We must act. Mrs. Zena taught me that when a woman decides to protect what she loves, she becomes a giant. Today I continue here, surrounded by my family, watching my grandchildren running around the yard, and I know that every choice back then shaped who I am today. If I could go back in time, I would do it all again. Looking at the horizon, I realize how life is made of difficult decisions and courage. Mrs. Zena and Clara changed my way of seeing the world and understanding what it truly means to be strong. And every time I miss them, I remember that tight hug we gave before following different paths, a hug that carried the promise of protection and eternal love. I know that the pain we lived through back then wasn't in vain. It was one of those scars that teach and strengthen, that show we have more strength than we imagine. And to you who listened to my story to the end, my heartfelt thanks. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. And if you want to support our little corner, click there and become a member of the channel. It will be a pleasure to have you closer to our family, following these stories of life and overcoming that warm the heart and remind us that hope always finds a way to bloom.